The bullet left the rifle at 2,800 feet per second, crossed 510 yards of open ground in less than 2 seconds, and struck the Japanese runner squarely between the shoulder blades as he sprinted toward the communications trench. He dropped mid-stride, his dispatch pouch tumbling into the mud, and every officer within earshot of the shot turned to stare at the dilapidated farmhouse attic where Corporal James Jimmy Dalton had just fired from what everyone else in the unit had dismissed as the worst sniper position in the sector. The attic rafter he'd been using wasn't just loose. It was visibly cracked, tilted at an odd angle, and situated in a building that looked ready to collapse at any moment. But Jimmy had seen something no one else had noticed. That broken rafter, that impossible angle, that unstable perch everyone told him to abandon, had just delivered the longest confirmed kill in battalion's history, and was about to change the way they fought this entire section of the front. It was February 1945, in the frozen outskirts of a small German village near the Roer River, and the American advance had stalled. The 9th Infantry Division had been grinding forward for weeks, taking brutal casualties with every yard gained, and now they were dug into a miserable stretch of farmland that offered almost no cover and even less visibility. German positions dotted the ridgeline to the east, well entrenched and expertly camouflaged, and any movement during daylight hours drew immediate fire. Snipers on both sides had turned the landscape into a lethal chessboard where patience and precision were the only currencies that mattered. The Americans held a cluster of shattered farm buildings on the western edge of the village, and the Germans controlled the high ground beyond. Between them lay 500 yards of frozen mud, barbed wire, and death. No man's land in every sense of the term. The German runners used a network of communication trenches to move between positions, carrying orders, intelligence reports, and supply requests. These runners were fast, disciplined, and nearly impossible to hit. They knew the exact timing, the blind spots, the angles that kept them safe. In 3 weeks of fighting, American snipers had managed to drop only 2 runners, and both kills had been at ranges under 300 yards. The Germans had adapted quickly, adjusting their routes and timing to minimize exposure. By mid-February, the runners were moving with near impunity, and American commanders were growing frustrated. They needed to disrupt German communications. They needed to create uncertainty, fear, hesitation. But they couldn't do that if the runners kept slipping through. Jimmy Dalton had been assigned to the sniper section only 3 weeks earlier. He was 22 years old, a farm kid from central Idaho who'd grown up hunting mule deer in the high desert country east of Boise. He wasn't a trained sniper in the formal sense. He'd never attended scout sniper school or received specialized instruction. He was just a rifleman with good eye and a natural understanding of ballistics who'd been handed a Springfield M1903A4 scope rifle and told to make himself useful. His platoon sergeant had noticed that Jimmy never missed. Not in training, not in combat, not when it mattered. He had that rare ability to read wind, estimate range, and adjust for elevation instinctively, the way some people can hear a song once and play it back perfectly. It wasn't something you could teach. You either had it or you didn't. Jimmy had it. So they gave him the rifle, paired him with a spotter named Eddie Ruiz, and sent him forward to find shooting positions in the ruined farmhouses that dotted the American line. The first week, Jimmy and Eddie worked out of a barn on the southern edge of the sector. It was a decent position, elevated enough to see into the German lines, with good concealment and multiple firing angles. Jimmy picked off 3 German soldiers in 5 days, all clean kills at ranges between 200 and 350 yards. But he couldn't get the runners. They moved too fast, stayed too low, and used the terrain too well. Every time Jimmy saw one, the target was either out of range or behind cover before he could line up the shot. Eddie kept telling him to be patient, that the opportunity would come, but Jimmy was getting restless. He'd studied the German movement patterns, mapped the communication trenches, and identified the choke points where a runner would be exposed. The problem was that none of those choke points were within effective range of the barn, the best angle. The one spot where a runner would be forced into the open for more than a second was 510 yards out, near a collapsed stone wall that marked the edge of the German-held territory. It was too far for a reliable shot from a barn. The angle was wrong, the elevation was insufficient, and the wind at that range was unpredictable. Jimmy needed a better position. He needed height, distance, and a clear line of sight. That's when he noticed the farmhouse. It sat about 200 yards forward of the barn, close to the front line, right on the edge of what the Americans considered safe territory. The building had taken artillery hits weeks earlier and was partially collapsed. The roof sagged dangerously. The walls were pockmarked with shrapnel, and the entire structure looked like it might come down in the next strong wind. No one was using it. It was too exposed, too damaged, too dangerous. But Jimmy walked through it one afternoon during a lull in the shelling and climbed the narrow staircase to the attic. The attic was a disaster. Half the roof was gone, exposing the interior to the elements. Snow had drifted in through the holes, covering the floor in a thin white layer. The rafters were cracked and splintered, hanging at odd angles. But when Jimmy crouched near the eastern wall and looked through a gap in the boards, he saw something that made his pulse quicken. From this angle, elevated and forward, he had a perfect view of the collapsed stone wall 510 yards away. He could see the communication trench that ran behind it, the small patch of open ground the runners had to cross, an exact spot where they were most vulnerable. This was a position he needed. This was a shot. Eddie was less enthusiastic. When Jimmy brought him to the attic the next day, Eddie took one look at the broken rafters and shook his head. "This whole place is ready to collapse," he said. "One good hit from artillery, and we're buried." Jimmy pointed to the rafter he planned to use as a shooting platform. It was a thick beam that ran horizontally along the eastern wall, positioned perfectly to support a prone shooting position. The problem was that the rafter had a visible crack running lengthwise through the wood, and it sagged noticeably under its own weight. It looked unstable. It looked dangerous. Eddie didn't like it. "That thing's going to snap the moment you put weight on it," he said. Jimmy tested it carefully, pressing down with his hand, then distributing his weight slowly. The rafter creaked, but it held. "It's stronger than it looks," Jimmy said. Eddie wasn't convinced, but he also knew that Jimmy had good instincts. If Jimmy thought this position could work, it was worth trying. They spent the rest of the day reinforcing the area around the rafter, wedging loose boards underneath for additional support, and clearing debris to create a clean shooting lane. Then they waited. The first morning in the attic, nothing happened. Jimmy and Eddie settled into position before dawn, watching the German lines through the scope, waiting for movement. The temperature was below freezing, and the wind cut through the gaps in the roof like a knife. Jimmy's fingers went numb inside his gloves, and his breath fogged the air in front of his face. But he didn't move. He stayed locked on the scope, scanning the stone wall, the trench line, the patches of open ground. Hours passed. The sun rose, pale and weak, offering no warmth. German soldiers moved in and out of view, but none of them were runners. None of them crossed the kill zone. By mid-afternoon, Eddie was ready to call it a day. "Maybe they changed the route," he said. Jimmy didn't answer. He was watching the trench. And then, just after 1,500 hours, he saw movement. A figure emerged from the trench line, low and fast, sprinting toward the stone wall. A runner. Jimmy's heart rate spiked, but his hand stayed steady. He tracked the figure through the scope, leading the target, calculating the range and windage in a fraction of a second he had. 510 yards. Wind from the northwest, maybe 5 miles per hour. The runner was moving at full speed, crossing the open ground in less than 3 seconds. Jimmy exhaled slowly, squeezed the trigger, and fired. The shot felt good the moment it left the barrel. Jimmy knew, in that instant before the bullet reached its target, that it was going to hit. The rifle's recoil pushed back against his shoulder. The crack of the shot echoed to the frozen air, and then there was silence. Through the scope, Jimmy watched the runner stumble and fall, his body collapsing forward into the mud. The dispatch pouch skittered across the ground. For a moment, nothing else moved. Then German soldiers emerged from the trench, dragging the body back under cover, shouting orders, scanning the American lines for the shooter. But they were looking in the wrong places. They were checking the barn, the obvious positions, the spots where snipers had fired from before. They weren't looking at the half-collapsed farmhouse that nobody in their right mind would use as a shooting position. Eddie was staring at Jimmy with wide eyes. "Did you just hit that?" he whispered. Jimmy lowered the rifle and nodded. 510 yards, he said quietly. "Give or take." Eddie let out a long breath. That was impossible. Jimmy didn't argue. It should have been impossible. The range was extreme, the target was moving, and the shooting platform was a cracked rafter in a building that looked ready to fall apart. But it had worked, and more importantly, Jimmy realized it could work again. They stayed in the attic for the rest of the day, watching the German reaction. There was confusion on the enemy side. Soldiers moved more cautiously. Runners hesitated before crossing open ground, and officers clustered in the trench line, trying to figure out where the shot had come from. By nightfall, word of the kill had spread through the American battalion. The company commander, Captain Reynolds, came to see Jimmy and Eddie personally. He climbed the stairs to the attic, looked at the broken rafter, and frowned. "You're telling me you made a 510-yard kill from this position?" he asked. Jimmy nodded. Reynolds walked to the eastern wall, looked through the gap in the boards, and studied the angle. He could see the stone wall, the communication trench, the entire stretch of ground where the runner had fallen. The position offered a perfect line of sight, but it also looked completely unstable. "This rafter could collapse at any moment," Reynolds said. "It's cracked. It's sagging. It's not safe." Jimmy had expected this reaction. Everyone who saw the position had the same concern. But Jimmy had spent hours on that rafter, testing its strength, understanding its quirks. He knew something the others didn't. "The crack runs with the grain," Jimmy explained. "It's not a structural failure. It's just weathering. The wood's still solid. And the sag actually helps. It creates a natural downward angle that's perfect for long-range shooting. I don't have to adjust my position or strain to get the elevation I need. The rafter does it for me." Reynolds considered this. He was a practical man, more concerned with results than regulations. If Jimmy could make shots from this position that no one else could make, then the position was worth keeping. "All right," Reynolds said finally, "you can stay here. But if this building takes a direct hit, I'm not digging you out." Jimmy nodded. That was good enough. Over the next week, Jimmy and Eddie turned the attic into a fortress. They reinforced the rafter with additional supports, created concealed firing ports in the walls, and established multiple fallback routes in case they needed to evacuate quickly. They brought in extra ammunition, water, rations, and a field telephone so they could communicate with the command post. The attic became their world. They lived there, slept there in shifts, and spent every daylight hour watching the German lines. Jimmy developed an intimate understanding of the enemy's routines. He knew when the shift changes happened, when supplies were moved, when officers made their rounds. He memorized every trench, every bunker, every piece of terrain between the farmhouse and the German positions. And most importantly, he learned the runners' patterns. They moved at specific times, always following the same routes, always crossing the same patches of open ground. It was predictable, and predictability was fatal. The second kill came 3 days after first. Another runner, this time moving south along the communication trench, sprinting across a gap near a shattered tree stump. Jimmy had been watching that spot for hours, waiting for the movement. When it came, he was ready. The shot was cleaner than the first, a center mass hit that dropped the target instantly. The German reaction was more intense this time. Artillery pounded the American positions for an hour, trying to suppress the sniper they couldn't locate. Shells screamed overhead, impacting around a barn and the other obvious shooting positions, but none landed near the farmhouse. The Germans still hadn't figured out where Jimmy was firing from. The third kill came 2 days later, then a fourth, then a fifth. Each time, Jimmy adjusted his tactics slightly, varying the timing, choosing different targets, keeping the Germans off balance. By the end of the second week, he'd eliminated 8 runners, more than the rest of the battalion snipers combined. The German communication network in that sector was starting to fracture. Orders were delayed, supply requests went unanswered, and coordination between units broke down. The Americans noticed the change immediately. German counterattacks became less organized, artillery responses were slower, and defensive positions weren't reinforced as quickly. Jimmy's work was having a strategic impact far beyond the individual kills. But success brought its own dangers. The Germans knew there was a sniper operating somewhere in the American lines with an unusually long effective range. They began sending out counter-sniper teams, expert marksmen tasked with hunting the hunter. Jimmy and Eddie spotted the first team on a cold morning in late February. Two men, moving carefully through the ruins of a barn on the German side, setting up a concealed position with a clear view of the American farmhouses. They were good. They moved slowly, used natural cover, and established their hide with professional precision, but they were looking in the wrong place. They were focused on the barn where Jimmy had worked during his first week, not the half-collapsed farmhouse 200 yards forward. Jimmy watched them through a scope for 20 minutes, studying their position, their equipment, their discipline. They were patient. They were skilled. They were dangerous. But they'd made one critical mistake. They'd assumed Jimmy was working from a standard position, using standard tactics, following standard doctrine. They didn't know about the loose rafter. They didn't know about the 510-yard angle. And that ignorance was going to kill them. Jimmy waited until both snipers were settled and focused on the barn. Then he took the first one, a clean headshot at 480 yards. The second sniper reacted immediately, scrambling for cover, trying to locate the source of the shot. But he was exposed for just a moment, just long enough. Jimmy's second shot caught him in the chest as he dove behind a pile of rubble. Both men were down within 5 seconds. The German lines erupted in confusion. Soldiers fired blindly toward the American positions. Machine guns raked the tree line, and officers shouted orders that went unheeded. But no one knew where the shots had come from. The Americans didn't have snipers who could make kills at that range from concealed positions. It wasn't possible, except it was. And Jimmy had just proven it again. Word of the counter-sniper kills reached division headquarters within hours. Senior officers began paying attention. Tactical analysts studied the engagement, trying to understand how a single rifleman with a standard-issue Springfield was outperforming specially trained German marksmen equipped with superior optics. The answer, they eventually realized, wasn't about equipment or training. It was about innovation. Jimmy had found an angle no one else had considered, a position no one else would use, and turned it into a devastating tactical advantage. The broken rafter, the unstable platform, the forward position that looked like a death trap, all to combine to create a shooting position that was nearly impossible to counter. The Germans couldn't locate him because they were looking for conventional sniper hides. They couldn't suppress him with artillery because they didn't know where to aim. And they couldn't outshoot him because his angle gave him a range advantage they couldn't match from their positions. But Jimmy wasn't thinking about tactics or doctrine. He was thinking about the men he was killing. Each shot, each kill, weighed on him in ways he hadn't expected. These weren't just targets. They were soldiers like him, young men doing their jobs, following orders, trying to survive. The runners he killed were usually teenagers, barely old enough to shave, carrying dispatches because someone had to and they'd drawn the short straw. Jimmy saw their faces through the scope. He saw the fear in their eyes as they prepared to sprint across open ground. He saw the moment they realized they'd been hit, the confusion and pain as they fell. And he felt nothing in those moments. That was what scared him. He'd become so good at killing, so efficient at his work, that it no longer affected him emotionally. He'd pull the trigger, watch the target drop, and immediately start scanning for the next one. It was mechanical, clinical, and it was changing him in ways he didn't fully understand. Eddie noticed a change. They'd been partners for weeks now, living in close quarters, sharing the tension and tedium of sniper work. Eddie saw the way Jimmy had stopped talking after kills, the way he'd sit in silence for hours, staring at the German lines, his expression blank. One evening, after Jimmy had dropped 2 runners in a single afternoon, Eddie finally said something. "You all right?" he asked. Jimmy didn't answer immediately. He was cleaning his rifle, running a patch through the barrel, checking the scope alignment. Finally, he said, "I'm fine." Eddie didn't believe him. "You don't look fine. You look like you're somewhere else." Jimmy set the rifle down and looked at Eddie. "I'm doing my job," he said quietly. "That's all." Eddie nodded slowly. "I know, but it's okay to feel something about it. These kills, they matter. They're helping us win, but they're still human beings." Jimmy looked away. "If I start thinking about that, I won't be able to do this anymore. And if I can't do this, more of our guys are going to die. So I can't think about it. I just have to shoot. That conversation stayed with Eddie for days. He understood what Jimmy was saying, understood the logic, but he also knew it was a dangerous path. Soldiers who stopped feeling, who turned themselves into killer machines, often didn't come back from that mindset. The war would end eventually, and then Jimmy would have to live with what he'd done, with the faces he'd seen through the scope, with the knowledge that he'd killed more men than most infantrymen would see in a lifetime. But there was no easy answer. The war demanded efficiency, demanded precision, demanded that men like Jimmy do terrible things so that other men could survive. It was a calculus of combat, cold and brutal and inescapable. By the first week of March, Jimmy's kill count had reached 17. All runners, all confirmed, all at ranges exceeding 400 yards. The German communication network in the sector was in shambles. Units operated in isolation. Supply lines broke down, and the defensive coordination that had made the German position so effective was unraveling. American intelligence officers intercepted German radio traffic that revealed the extent of the disruption. German commanders were demanding answers, accusing each other of incompetence, and desperately trying to figure out how to protect their runners. Some units stopped using runners entirely, relying instead on radio communication, which made them vulnerable to American signal intelligence. Others changed their routes and timing so frequently that their own soldiers became confused. The breakdown was systemic, and it was entirely due to one man firing from position no one believed could work. Captain Reynolds came to the attic again in early March, this time with a major from division headquarters. The major wanted to see the position for himself, wanted to understand how Jimmy was achieving these results. He climbed the stairs carefully, mindful of the building's instability, and entered the attic. He looked at the broken rafter, the improvised supports, the firing port carved into the wall. Then he looked at the range card Jimmy had created, a detailed map showing every distance, every angle, every target area within his field of fire. The major studied it for a long time, occasionally glancing to the gap in the wall to compare the map with the actual terrain. Finally, he turned to Jimmy and said, "This shouldn't work. The rafter's compromised, the building's unstable, and you're exposed to counter-battery fire. By every tactical standard, this position should have failed." Jimmy met his gaze. "It works because no one expects it to work," he said. "The Germans are looking for conventional positions. They're trained to identify standard sniper hides. This doesn't fit the pattern, so they don't see it. And the rafter's not as weak as it looks. The crack's superficial. The real strength is in the core wood, and that's still solid." The major nodded slowly. "You've essentially created a blind spot in their tactical awareness. They can't counter a threat, they can't conceptualize." Jimmy hadn't thought of it that way, but the major was right. He'd found a gap in the enemy's mental model of how battles were fought, and he'd exploited it ruthlessly. The major asked Jimmy to demonstrate his technique. Jimmy settled into his firing position on a rafter, adjusted the rifle, and scanned the German lines. Within 5 minutes, he spotted movement near the stone wall, a runner preparing to cross. Jimmy tracked the target, calculated the lead, adjusted for wind, and fired. The shot was perfect. The runner dropped 510 yards away, and the major watched through binoculars, stunned. "That was a moving target at extreme range," he said. "How did you make that calculation so quickly?" Jimmy shrugged. "Practice. I've been watching this ground for weeks. I know how fast they move, how the wind affects the bullet at this range, how much lead I need. It's not really calculation anymore. It's just instinct." The major looked at Captain Reynolds. "We need to document this. If one man can do this from an improvised position, imagine what a trained team could accomplish with proper equipment and support." Reynolds nodded, but he also understood something the major didn't. What Jimmy was doing wasn't just about technique or equipment. It was about a specific combination of skill, terrain, and circumstance that couldn't easily be replicated. The loose rafter worked because of its unique angle and position. Another location might not offer the same advantages, and Jimmy's instinctive understanding of ballistics wasn't something you could teach in a training course. Some soldiers had it. Most didn't. You couldn't mass-produce what Jimmy was doing. You could only recognize it when it appeared and support it as much as possible. Over the next 2 weeks, The American command made several attempts to expand Jimmy's success. They brought in other snipers, showed them the position, explained the techniques Jimmy was using. Some of them tried to set up similar positions in other buildings. None of it worked. The other snipers couldn't replicate Jimmy's results. They didn't have his instinctive feel for the range and wind. They didn't have his patience. They didn't have his willingness to trust a broken rafter that everyone else said would fail. And most importantly, they didn't have the weeks of observation and practice that had allowed Jimmy to understand every detail of the terrain and enemy behavior. Sniper work, they realized, was as much art as science. You could teach the fundamentals, but you couldn't teach the intuition that separated good snipers from exceptional ones. Jimmy had that intuition, and the Army's best course of action was to leave him alone and let him work. By mid-March, the German High Command had finally identified the general area where Jimmy was operating. They didn't know the exact building, but they knew the shots were coming from the forward American positions near the farmhouse cluster. They responded with a sustained artillery barrage, targeting every structure in that sector. For 3 days, shells hammered the American lines, destroying buildings, collapsing trenches, and forcing soldiers to take cover in cellars and bunkers. The farmhouse where Jimmy worked took several near misses. Shrapnel tore through the walls. The remaining roof timbers caught fire, and the entire structure shook with each impact. Eddie wanted to evacuate. "This place is coming down," he said. "We need to move." But Jimmy refused. "If we leave now, they win," he said. "They're trying to drive us out because they can't find us. If we move, they'll just adjust and target the next position. We stay." Eddie thought Jimmy was being reckless, maybe even suicidal. But he also knew that Jimmy understood the tactical situation better than anyone. If Jimmy said they should stay, there was probably a reason. The reason became clear on the 4th day. The artillery barrage stopped abruptly, and the Germans launched a probing attack, sending a platoon-sized element across the no-man's land to test the American defenses. They expected the forward positions to be abandoned or destroyed. They expected to encounter minimal resistance. They were wrong. Jimmy had spent a 3-day barrage preparing for exactly this scenario. He'd reinforced the Rafter even further, stockpiled ammunition, and mapped every approach route the Germans might use. When the attack came, he was ready. The German soldiers advanced in a skirmish line, moving quickly across the open ground. Jimmy started firing. One shot every few seconds, methodical and precise. German soldiers fell, one after another, dropping in the mud before they even understood where the fire was coming from. The attack faltered, then broke. The survivors retreated, dragging their wounded, leaving bodies scattered across the field. Jimmy had single-handedly repulsed a platoon-level attack from a position everyone had written off as destroyed. The psychological impact on the Germans was devastating. They'd thrown artillery, counter-snipers, and infantry at this sector, and they still couldn't neutralize one American rifleman. It was demoralizing. It was inexplicable. And it fundamentally altered how they approached operations in that area for the rest of the campaign. American commanders recognized the broader implications. Jimmy's success wasn't just about individual marksmanship. It was about the power of unconventional thinking. Military doctrine existed for good reasons, codifying lessons learned through years of combat experience. But doctrine could also become dogma, blinding soldiers to opportunities that fell outside established patterns. Jimmy had succeeded because he'd been willing to question assumptions. He'd looked at a broken rafter in a collapsing building and seen potential instead of liability. He'd calculated that the tactical advantages outweighed the physical risks. And he'd been right. That willingness to think differently, to trust his own judgment over conventional wisdom, was what separated him from other soldiers. It was a lesson that applied far beyond sniper tactics. Innovation in warfare, in any field, required individuals who could see possibilities others missed and who had the courage to pursue them despite skepticism and resistance. By late March, the front lines had shifted. The American advance resumed, pushing the Germans back toward the Rhine. The farmhouse sector was no longer a critical position, and Jimmy and Eddie were reassigned to a new area. Jimmy took one last look at the attic before he left. The broken rafter was still there, sagging and cracked, covered in dust and debris. It didn't look like much. It never had. But it had been a foundation for 17 confirmed kills and a tactical victory that had rippled through an entire sector of the front. Jimmy wondered if anyone would ever know the full story. If anyone would understand how a supposedly unstable shooting position had changed the course of local battles. Probably not. Wars were full of stories like this. Small moments of ingenuity and courage that made big differences but were forgotten in the broader sweep of history. Jimmy survived the war. He was discharged in late 1945 and returned to Idaho, where he went back to farming and tried to rebuild the life he'd left behind. He didn't talk much about his combat experience. When people asked what he'd done during the war, he'd say he'd been a rifleman and leave it at that. He never mentioned the attic, the loose rafter, or the 17 runners he'd killed from 510 yards away. It wasn't shame, exactly. It was more a sense that those experiences belonged to a different person, a version of himself he'd left behind in Europe. He'd done what needed to be done, survived, and come home. That was enough. But the story didn't entirely disappear. Other soldiers from his unit remembered. They talked about the sniper who'd operated from the impossible position, who made shots no one believed were possible, who'd held a sector almost single-handedly. The story spread through veteran networks, was mentioned in unit histories, and eventually caught the attention of military historians studying sniper tactics in World War II. Researchers tracked down Eddie Ruiz, who kept detailed notes of their time in the attic. Eddie provided testimony about Jimmy's techniques, the position's unique advantages, and the psychological impact on German forces. Slowly, Jimmy's story was reconstructed and documented, becoming a case study in unconventional tactics and individual initiative. The broader lesson of Jimmy's success was eventually incorporated into sniper training doctrine. Modern sniper schools teach students to look beyond obvious positions, to consider unconventional angles, and to trust their judgment when terrain offers unique opportunities. The loose rafter principle, as some instructors call it, emphasizes that apparent weaknesses can sometimes be strengths if understood and exploited properly. It's a reminder that warfare is not just about following established procedures, but about adapting, innovating, and thinking creatively under pressure. Jimmy never knew his work would influence training decades later. He never sought recognition or tried to share his story publicly. He was content to live quietly, to farm his land, and to let the war fade into memory. He died in 1989, at the age of 66, surrounded by family who knew him as a husband, father, and farmer, not as a sniper who defied expectations and changed tactical outcomes from a broken rafter in a collapsing building. But his legacy endures. Every sniper who learns to question assumptions, who looks at terrain with fresh eyes, who trusts their instincts over conventional wisdom, is channeling something Jimmy understood instinctively. War demands conformity in many ways, but it also rewards those rare individuals who can see past the rules to the underlying principles. Jimmy saw a crack in a rafter and understood it wasn't a weakness but a feature. He saw a collapsing building and recognized it as the best position on the front. He saw targets 510 yards away and knew he could hit them when everyone else said it was impossible. That kind of vision, that willingness to trust yourself when others doubt, is rare. It's the quality that turns ordinary soldiers into extraordinary ones, that transforms desperate situations into victories, and that reminds us that human ingenuity and determination can overcome almost any obstacle. Jimmy Dalton embodied that quality, and though his name isn't widely known, though his achievements were never properly recognized in his lifetime, the impact of what he did from that attic in February and March of 1945 continues to resonate. It's a story about more than marksmanship or tactics. It's a story about seeing possibilities where others see impossibilities, about trusting your judgment when conventional wisdom says you're wrong, and about the profound difference one person can make when they refuse to accept limitations others take for granted. If this story moved your heart, subscribe for more untold stories of courage and innovation that shaped history.